Assuming that you're familiar with what direct objects and indirect objects are, today we'll be exploring something that is often confused, and that's object complements. We'll be exploring certain difficulties pertaining to the use and identification of direct objects, indirect objects, and object complements, and how to differentiate between them. We all know that direct and indirect objects are linked together, but in spite of that, their relationship is very one-sided. Indirect objects are always going to need a direct object. That is pretty much the purpose of their existence. On the other hand, a direct object doesn't need an indirect object. Direct objects and indirect objects can only be in a sentence if the preceding verb is a transitive verb, meaning it requires something to make sense of the sentence. Intransitive verbs can stand alone and hence do not need an object at all. Let's have a little overview of transitive and intransitive verbs through some examples. I want that glass of water. The word want is a transitive verb because it leaves us with the question, want what, right? If you just said, I want, then that wouldn't really make sense. So verbs like want, take, show, and see are transitive verbs. I took the front seat. I showed her my favorite movie. She saw her best friend in her dream last night. Let's move on to intransitive verbs. You should sit in the back of the class. The word sit is followed by a prepositional phrase in the given example. It's an intransitive verb because it doesn't need an object to make sense. It's not dependent on anything. If you just said, you should sit, the sentence would still make 100% sense. Some more examples. She sings rather loudly. Sometimes I worry a lot. You should rest once in a while. Note that some verbs, like worry, can be both transitive and intransitive. Okay, so now, let's get back to our main topic. Have a look at this sentence. Raymond stole my car. We have our subject, Raymond, the main verb stole, and the direct object, my car. Direct objects are the recipients of the verb's action. Stole what? My car. Another example would be, Raymond stole my car for Jessie. Now, along with the direct object, my car, we also have our indirect object, which would be Jessie. Indirect objects receive the direct objects. They're usually people or animals, anything sentient. Here's the grammatical chain. The subject does the action. That action is our transitive verb. The transitive verb results in a direct object. That direct object is passed to or received by the indirect object, either at the time of speaking or sometime later. There's a lot of confusion surrounding these three topics, and honestly, I get it, because I used to go through that as well when I was an ESL student. The reason it gets so confusing is that all three of these topics are all about object this and object that. They all have to bow down to the supreme deity that is our subject, because without the subject, these three really would have no relevance. I mean, without a subject, there would be no direct object. Without a direct object, we would have neither an indirect object nor an object complement. So how do we differentiate between these three, especially between an indirect object and an object complement? Both of them are dependent on direct objects and can trick us into believing that one of them is either. Let's have a look at two examples. John bought some ice cream for his daughter. Mickey made Sanpei the new manager of ABC Company. First things first. Before figuring out what is what, locate the verb. By doing so, you progress one step ahead and it clears the confusion by, let's say, 40%. So in the first one, our verb is bought. In our second example, the verb is made. Let's rack our brains a little and think back to the very basic rule. A sentence can only have an object if the verb is a transitive verb, meaning any verb that is required to receive something to make sense. and that something is what we call an object. John bought what? He bought ice cream. That's our object. Imagine simply saying, John bought some for his daughter. You'd literally find a bunch of question marks circling around your head because you can just tell that the sentence is very unpleasantly incomplete. Bought is an action verb. It's a transitive verb that takes an object. So the sentence has to be, John bought some ice cream. He bought that ice cream for whom? His daughter? That's the indirect object. As we already know, indirect objects can be removed from a sentence, and the sentence would still make sense. So we know for sure that John is the subject, bought is the main verb, ice cream is the direct object, and daughter is the indirect object. How about the second one? Mickey made Sanpei the new manager of ABC Company. Mickey is most definitely the subject. It's the main emphasis here. Mickey made something, right? The verb's definitely a transitive one. But the question is, Mickey made what? Sanpei? Mickey cannot actually make a person. That'd be a bit ridiculous to imagine. But at the same time, Mickey made the new manager of ABC doesn't make all that much sense either. Well, here's the rub. Some verbs have different meanings. The verb make is one such verb. In our example, the word make doesn't equal preparing something. Rather, it means to assign or appoint. So the object of this sentence is definitely Sanpei, as he's the one being appointed. Does that make the phrase the new manager the indirect object? Not at all. The phrase the new manager is simply a description of a sort. It's telling us something about the object. It's not receiving the direct object in any way. When there's a verb, a direct object, and an indirect object in a sentence, the action moves from the subject to the verb, then to the direct object, and then to the indirect object. In our example, that's not the case. The action stops at the direct object. When a word or a phrase follows a direct object and replaces or describes it to tell what it is or what it has become, we call that word or phrase an object complement. Object complements are necessary, unlike indirect objects, which can be removed in certain cases. Object complements are nouns, noun phrases, adjectives, or adjectival phrases. In our example, the object complement is the adjective happy, and it's describing the direct object me. Let's take a good look at a few more examples. He got the keys for me. He, subject. Keys is the direct object. Me is the indirect object. The company announced a bonus for those working hard. The company, subject. Bonus is the direct object. Those working hard is the indirect object. They appointed a leader who's good at communicating with the public. They, subject. Leader is the direct object. Who's good at communicating with the public is a relative pronoun phrase. It's not the indirect object. The relative pronoun, who, is the subject of the relative clause, also known as the adjective clause, and is giving us more information about the subject. Hence, the entire phrase is the object complement. I called him ugly to his face last night. I is the subject, him is the direct object, and ugly is the object complement. The word ugly is not receiving the direct object in any way. It's not acting as the recipient. Just like indirect objects, object complements are required to have a direct object. Otherwise, how would we know what or whom the object complement is? I guess you could say an indirect object isn't all alone after all. It shares the I need a direct object fate with an object complement, though they both are essentially quite different from each other. Alright, so I want you to go through these examples now. The pie smells tasty according to me. The milk has gone bad. What are the subjects here? Pie and milk. That's absolutely right. What are the main verbs here? Smells and is gone. Right again. So what are the direct objects? Tasty and bad. Isn't that correct? No. You see, As I mentioned before, only transitive verbs can have objects. Intransitive verbs cannot. The word smells and has gone in this case are being used as linking verbs. Linking verbs connect subjects to their predicates. They basically tell us what the subject is or has become. Because linking verbs state or describe the connection between the subject and its predicate, nominal or adjectival, they don't take any objects. So folks, thanks for tuning in for today's lesson on direct and indirect objects and object complements. Make sure you're on the lookout for more amazing lessons in the future. Until next time, arrivederci.